All right, now, Linux is possibly a new operating system for most of you. Very few people really get into it or fiddle around with it, especially on an entry level. But Windows, you're probably much more familiar with. Most of you are probably running Windows or the Mac OS. And by the way, the Mac OS really applies to a lot of the same things I'm going to say here about Windows 11. And by the way, it also, not just Windows 11, the comparison will be valid for any modern version of Windows. Windows 8, 8.1, 10, 11, 12 is coming out soon. So it's probably going to apply pretty well broadly across all of those. And with Windows, it has a graphical user interface, or a GUI, as what we usually refer to that as. Likewise, Linux also has a GUI, so that they have in common. Now, the GUI that you'll find on most Linux operating systems is kind of Windows-ish. I'll show it to you by demonstration here, possibly in the next nugget, so we can kind of get a comparison there, or so we can kind of see what it looks like. Because right now, it's kind of just theoretical, right? You haven't actually clicked on anything in Linux, or seen it, maybe. So originally, though, Linux was text only, and it was also very small, which we'll get to here in a few minutes here as well. So Windows 10 or 11, or any modern version of Windows, is the most widely used operating system. We saw that earlier when we were looking in the first video here about worldwide distributions of operating systems. Linux is less frequently used, but it is growing fast. It has a very enthusiastic following. And just on a personal note, I'll tell you, Linux is fun to use. There's no end to the amount of tinkering and exploring and everything that you can do with it, partially because different flavors of Linux, that's what we call the different distributions. Distributions can also be known as flavors. They all have different desktops that they can run. They all have different features that they can run and so forth. So it's not like we're just locked into Windows and whatever Microsoft spoon feeds us, we have to swallow that. You know, we can use kind of whatever version or flavor of Linux we want. We can modify the UI however we want to, or if we don't find anything we like, we can get a different one that's available on the internet and kind of paste that into our Linux distribution. So lots of flexibility. That's a big word with Linux, is flexibility. All right. Also, the focus on Windows is servers and desktop users. Okay, so when we see the largest number of installed operating systems out there in the world, that probably is going to focus mostly on the desktop users. They're the lion's share for what accounts for so many installed Windows systems out there. But there are also servers that Microsoft has out there, and probably going to be in large part Windows Server 2008, Windows Server 2012, Windows Server 2016, Windows Server 2022. Those are all very common and probably the lion's share of all the distributions out there. Although Windows Server 2025 is also on the horizon. I think it's 25, yes. And one of the reasons why Windows servers are becoming more prevalent as well is because administrators are already familiar with Windows if they've been using the desktop operating system. They'll know how to make their way around a lot of the same features on a server. Although, of course, on a server, there's a lot more features that are not available on a desktop, right? So the focus on Linux is also servers, and that's a big part of where you'll find Linux installed. But it also has special purposes. So, for example, you'll see this, some flavor of it at least, on your Android operating system. Android is actually a specialized flavor of Linux. You might also, again, find it in a lot of home automation systems, a lot of special purpose systems. But it's also growing on the desktop because it's easy to install. It's free. You can download some flavor of Linux just about anywhere. And they're very good. They're very stable as well. That's another reason why on the server front, Linux is really gaining a foothold. See, there's a kind of a magic number when it comes to servers and reliability. What we want is 5 nines, okay? I don't know how else to write that. 5 nines of uptime. In other words, we want 99.999% uptime. That equivocates to roughly 5 minutes of unplanned downtime per year. Most server systems, whether they're Windows or whatever, they're usually pretty fortunate if they could get by with 4 nines. So a little bit less than that. But a lot of Linux systems are going to be 5 nines. That means a lot of Linux systems can run for years without ever having to be rebooted or without ever having unexpected downtime. Now, Windows is catching up to that. It used to be we'd kind of just mock Windows because we'd say you'd have to reboot it just about every day, if not every week, Well, nowadays, you can have Windows systems that run quite a long time, but I would still have to say, and this is partially just my opinion, you probably will still not find the same level of uptime as you will on a lot of these Linux systems. Windows is catching up because some of the Windows distributions, if you will, don't use Windows. They're text-based only, like Windows Server Core, for example, is one of those that we would call that. And there's some other ones as well that don't have fancy wallpapers and windows and a start menu and all of that kind of stuff. What else we got here? The commands. Okay, so the commands, you can run commands from the graphical user interface on Windows, from a command prompt, or from a PowerShell prompt. Likewise, here with Linux, you can do similar things. They have a graphical user interface, which is growing and I'd say pretty attractive and fun to work with. They have Bash, which is kind of their equivalent of the CMD, if you will. Really, it's a terminal, if you will. You can open up a terminal, and it can run some command interpreter, such as Bash, if I'm being technical about that. But PowerShell, which was really developed by Jeffrey Snover and I guess a couple of other people at Microsoft, and originally was designed to automate Windows operating systems, they have now expanded that so that it's also capable of running PowerShell on Linux. It's kind of becoming a universal shell that you can use to run really just a lot of different operating systems, or to administer a lot of different operating systems. Now, Windows has a very large code base. Current versions of Windows are, if I remember right, between 60 and 100 million lines of code. Wow, can you imagine that? There's not a single person, I have to believe this, there's not a single person at Microsoft that knows every line of code in Windows. They'd have to have beyond a photographic memory. First of all, they'd have to memorize all those lines of code, but secondly, they'd have to understand every part of it. I don't think there's anybody that does. There are just discrete chunks of employees at Microsoft that know various parts of it. Some of them know more about the graphical user interface. Some of them know more about various servers or services and so forth. Okay. Well, with Linux, it had initially a much smaller code base. Okay. Originally, when Linus Torvalds created this, it had only 88 files and it was 231 kilobytes in size. Oh, that reminds me, by the way, I never mentioned why it's called Linux. That has to do with a combination of things. It was Linus Torvalds, okay, so Linus, and then also Unix, and they kind of combined those to come up with Linux. Okay, so that's why that is done that way. Anyway, Linux is also growing in size. Right now, I think a lot of Linux distributions are 40 million lines of code. A lot of that's because they now have a UI. They have a graphical user interface. So just that fact alone has to expand the code base. But it is still considered to be very reliable, and a lot of people would argue that it's more reliable than Windows. Thanks for watching. Subscribe here to get the latest from CBT Nuggets. Also, if you're new to IT or are interested in an IT career, visit cbtnuggets.com and sign up for a free trial.